Yeah, but analogue synths sound much better than VSTs. Or do they? So I thought I would talk a little bit more about Goa music, as most people seem to be interested in that particular subject. So I thought I'd speak a bit more about that. An interesting question I got asked was back in the old days when you were using the analog equipment, is it actually better? Does it sound better? Is that why those old records we keep listening to rather than listening to the newer stuff? And I have to say, well, let me answer it like this. I think the older equipment did have some advantages, but it's not, the advantage wasn't in the sound necessarily. Now, some people are going to disagree with me, obviously, but my take on it is using the older equipment had two distinct advantages. The first of which doesn't really appear to be much of an advantage at first blush, but if you think about it, it is. And that is that the earlier equipment had limitations. It had a limited sonic palette. A big sonic palette, you can do a lot with even a single oscillator synthesizer with a basic setup, but it was a limited palette, and that has the advantage of forcing you to be creative in a couple of different ways. One of which is that it forces you to learn every corner of the parameters and become very familiar with what this thing can do. So that you get to really know it, and you get to understand where the better sounds are, where the not so good sounds are, where it sounds best, where its strengths and weaknesses are. And it also, because it's a limited amount of parameters, you can actually easily get to them once you understand the synthesizer. So, for example, if you want to get a particular sound, you go, oh, I just do this, twist, there it is. So that's one way in which it's an advantage. You have a familiarity with it and you can get to the sounds quickly. Another advantage of a limited palette is it forces you to think more compositionally or more musically. In other words, you know you have that type of sound from that machine, and it makes you think, well, how can I use that? In the same way that without wanting to sound grandiose, a composer, an orchestral composer would go, well, I know what the contrabass sounds like, I know what the violin section sounds like, and the French horns sound like this. I want to have the violin section come in, followed by the contrabass, punctuated by the French horns. And he can imagine it because he knows what things sound like. In the same way, if you have synths with limited palette, it forces you to think more musically, more compositionally, rather than the opposite, which is having an unending, infinite sonic palette, where you just tend to easily get lost in the possibilities. Option anxiety kicks in. Is this pad better than this pad? Or maybe, no, this pad is better than that one. No, what about that other pad? Now, and then you listen to, this is what I do, I listen to all three or four and think, no, actually, I remember one. So I go back to something else that I thought was good, then I compare it, and this is such a waste of time. Because this sounds good, and this sounds good, and this sounds good. Who's to say which is the best? So having an unlimited sonic palette can and often does get in the way of creativity. And when I say creativity, I mean making music, composing music. As opposed, you can call creating patches creativity, fine. But this is in the context of making music, making a finished piece of music, as opposed to dicking around for hours not getting anything done. Or maybe you make some patches, but it depends what your goal is. If you're a patch designer, that's fine, no problem. But if you're making records, then having a limited sonic palette and knowing what it is helps you to focus on your priority, which is to create finished music. So that's another way that a limited sonic palette helps you. In other words, first of all, you know what the synth does, you know its strengths and weaknesses because you know the good bits and the bad bits, and you can get to it easily. Two, it makes you think musically, how can I use that sound? And okay, so that's limited sonic palette of the older equipment, the older analog stuff. Like, for example, a Juno 106 or an Ovation bass station or an SH 101. Another advantage, or the second advantage, to the older analog equipment is that for the most part it had a one knob per parameter interface, which is designed for human hands. It has knobs which you can twist, and it has sliders and a few buttons that you can press, and these are easily made to be real-time controllable. So you can actually get your hands on the sound, twist it into the way that you want it to be. And that's one thing, having an actual physical interface. But importantly, you have one knob per parameter. So with a MIDI controller, for example, on my MIDI controller, I can control the envelope release with my knob number 8 on mine of Zebra. But that controls the cutoff on another soft synth, and it might control the envelope depth on another one. So that parameter doesn't always do the same thing. So I can't just instinctively grab it and then twist. So a one knob parameter interface on a synthesizer encourages the same kind of relationship that you have with a musical instrument. In other words, if you turn this knob, it always does that. And in this part of its range, it's always going to sound like that. It's not going to be another parameter on another patch. So the sum net result of that is that you form a relationship with the synthesizer, an intuitive relationship where you hear a sound, you think, oh, I know how to get that, done. And I can hit record and tweak that knob, sending out MIDI or CV or whatever, and there it is, recorded. So you can just get on with making the music. So there are two distinct advantages. Now, as to whether the analog equipment, older stuff, had some kind of special analog source, I don't agree. I will say that the earlier VSTs weren't quite up to it. You know, the first couple of years that VSTs came out, the sound wasn't quite there. But I think what sealed it for me was the release of Rebirth. I think it's about 2000, which is a 303 emulator by Propellerheads. And it sounds, for all intents and purposes, exactly like a 303. It killed the 303 second-hand market overnight when it was released. 303s were going for like £1,200 in the UK. Suddenly, bang, when that came out, it was over. And 303s dropped way down in price. So we're talking sound now, we're not talking interface, because if you have a real 303, you've got an interface. But we're talking sound, and for all intents and purposes, the sound is the same. There's been other 303 emulators that have come out since then, and they sound, to my ear, the same. Put it this way, often there's more variation between one 303 and another 303 than there is between the software and the real 303. Another thing I remember when another nail in the coffin was when Imposca came out, which was an emulation of the Oscar. And I was over at Dickster studio. We were making a tune together, and Dick has got 2 old Oscars. He made a lot of the Green Nuns leads on those back in the day, and so we had a copy of Imposca. We were making a tune, but we took some time out, and we were, got the Imposca, the software version up, and the hardware version, and listened, and we couldn't tell the difference. So, if we can't tell the difference, there's a real one, this one, As I said, for all intents and purposes, it's the same. The quality is the same. Now, of course, some people may disagree, and I expect them to. But from my point of view, it's kind of, it's a done deal. VSTs are as good, and in some cases much better than the old analogue or old synthesizers. Take Omnisphere, for example. It's insanely powerful, and has a synthesizer section that I don't think has ever appeared in hardware synths, granular, etc. Plus massively huge sample banks of incredibly well crafted sample banks by gifted sound designers. So yeah, main advantage of the older stuff from my point of view was limited amount of parameters, limited sound palette, and a 1 knob per parameter interface that you could form a relationship with in the same way that you form a relationship with a musical instrument that you play for years. There you go. And if you were reasonably entertained by my waffling, then please hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you can be informed of any further ramblings by me. Thanks, it helps out. Cheers.